My name is Rich Ivory. I'm the current chair of psychology. I couldn't help but start with an advertisement. Those of you who are getting tired of our somewhat dated web page should be happy to know that in the next week or so we'll be releasing a new web page. It won't always feature Bob Knight's face. It'll actually be featuring different people on a modern rotating basis, but we just gave you a little taste, a little sampler here of what will be coming up when you come to search for us starting in about a week or so. So today's a most special occasion. We've not only come together for one of our 2 annual special lectureships, the Tryon Lecture, but it's being delivered by 2 of our most distinguished faculty members, Al Riley and Steve Glickman. Before introducing the speakers, I wanted to say a few words about the lectureship in general. So it's named after Robert Choate Tryon, who was a member of our faculty. He was born in Butte, Montana in 1901, so just after the start of the department. I actually don't know much about his younger years. I do know that he lived the majority of his time in California, and really he lived his life at the University of California. He was an undergraduate here, graduated in 1924, stayed on to do his graduate studies and earned his Ph.D. in psychology in 1928. He continued right on in the department, was appointed to the faculty. Wasn't that nice? We have so many graduate students now who would like the same thing. And he started off as a research fellow here and was actually then appointed to the faculty in 1931. He had a short foray where they called him off to Washington during World War II, but he quickly came back to campus right after the war and stayed here and was a member of the faculty up to his death in 1967. So if you tally it up, he spent a 53-year stint on this campus. Now, his extraordinary contributions to science really began in graduate school. He worked with Edward Tolman and Lloyd Jeffers. And as part of his graduate work, it was methodologically oriented to start, he developed a state-of-the-art automated recording apparatus for the laboratory study of behavior. And while the methods allowed the quantification of behavior in populations, his intellectual interests really centered on individual differences within that population. His doctoral dissertation was titled Individual Differences at Successive Stages of Learning. And this work was then, and continues to this day, really to be a landmark study of animal behavior, setting the ground for what has really come to be called behavioral genetics. I'm not going to review in detail his studies there, but I will mention that these classic studies, probably familiar to many of you, involved these selective breeding programs with rats in which the matings were based on May's learning capacity. And from this, he developed his legendary 2 strains of rats, strains that are still referred to in textbooks as May's bright and May's dull. So again, many of you might not have heard of Tryon's name or remember that, but I imagine you're familiar with those 2 terms. At the time of his work, the nature-nurture issue was being heatedly contested in psychology, but really with the rise of behaviorism, an emphasis on environmental factors as determinants of behavior had become dogmatic. And Tryon's study really constituted the principle of contrary evidence. Indeed, this work almost alone preserved hereditary concepts from complete obliteration within the psychology of learning, and the influence of his work then was immense and continues, I think, to this day to shape the field of behavioral genetics. Tryon was also instrumental in the development of what has come to be known as human behavioral ecology. He was guided by the assumption that people in urban regions are grouped together in so-called social areas, and that these social groupings can be studied and measured objectively. His original analysis was based on data from neighborhoods in San Francisco Bay Area, and they revealed patterns of stability that suggested that social niches that were reproductively isolated from one another. So he went on to study systematically these environmental stressor situations that have such an impact on social groups. Tryon was deeply committed to the department and university, and including one stint as chair of the department. But if you'd been paying attention to the slideshow, you might have noticed that his stint as chair, I believe, lasted for all of 1 year. So I wish I could consult with him about how he pulled that off. Interestingly, his biographers emphasized that his main contributions here were to reduce the power and role of the chairman, an influence that I can attest to continues to the present. And speaking at a memorial dedicated to Tryon, one of his colleagues, Bhuwan Joshi, said, quote, "Tryon never made any distinction between work and play. His work was always his play." The Tryon Memorial Lectureship was established to commemorate his distinguished career. I haven't really been able to find the original charter. We did find a document indicating that the fund was established right after his death, and it was intended to support these lectureships for a limited period of 25 years. Now, I don't know if it reflects wise investing on our part, or I suspect more neglectful bookkeeping on the part of the university, but we're pleased that we continue to sponsor the lectureship 45 years after his death instead of the 25-year limit. Now, today's lecture is going to be given by Professors Al Riley and Steve Glickman. We had originally planned to include Professor Harrison Goff on the podium, but health issues prevented him from joining us today. We turned to these three for two reasons, really. First, their scientific careers capture the spirit of Tryon's work and interests, especially themes about studying animals with an eye on their unique ecological context. Second, we also recognize that we had an extraordinary opportunity here to capture an oral history of our department. I believe it's with just 1, maybe 2 degrees of separation that Al and Steve span all of the people who have ever served on our faculty. I'm not going to provide a long review of Al and Steve's scientific careers. We all know how modest the two of them are, and we've already caused them enough stress today by recording this event. So, but I do have to say briefly that, just give you a little background, that Al was born in Illinois and got his education in the Midwest. He received his BA from Denison College in Ohio in 1943, his Ph.D. at Ohio State in 1950, and then he moved directly from Ohio State to here, joining our faculty in that same year, again, note, without any intervening postdoc. Al retired in 1991, but as we all know, he's remained a very active presence in Tolman to this day. His contributions in learning theory and animal cognition are many, including fundamental work on stimulus generalization. The Comparative Cognition Society recognized the importance of Al's theoretical and empirical contributions when he was selected to receive the equivalent of their Lifetime Achievement Award in 2010. Al's service record on the campus and beyond was exceptional, and he's one of the few members of our department to ever receive the Berkeley citation. That was in 1992. Steve was born, I believe, New York City. I know, educated there. He graduated from Brooklyn College in 1954. Before heading north to Montreal for his graduate work, he joined the amazing group headed then by Don Hebb at McGill University. Following some initial academic appointments at Northwestern and Michigan, Steve moved to Berkeley in 1968. He retired 40 years later, but like Al, his scientific work has continued unabated. In fact, just this past week, I was reviewing his recent scholarly achievements and preparing his reappointment letter for the dean. Steve's work has centered around the relationship of motivation and behavior and include many elegant studies that have combined physiological and behavioral methods. He authored a classic paper that involved a cross-species comparison of curiosity, and one that we could easily imagine that the motivation for was, sort of a self-appraisal is the way I look at it. A hallmark of Steve's career has been his openness to really recognizing interesting situations in nature and then used to ask really fundamental questions. His most recent work was inspired by the unusual anatomy and physiology of the hyena and asking then about the implications of this on their social behavior. Like Al, Steve's received many awards for his work, including election to the Society of Experimental Psychologists and also an appointment to a chancellor's professorship on our campus. I should also point out that both Steve and Al have occupied the shoes I filled today, serving as chairs of the department. Steve held the post from 1977 to 1982, and then he passed on the baton to Al for a 5-year term that ended in 1987. I arrived here in 1981, so I didn't have any direct observations on the leadership, on their leadership. I can tell you, though, that I have benefited tremendously from their sage and calming wisdom over the last 20 years. Now, we're not here today to hear about their personal scientific odysseys and nor about their thoughts on department administration. Rather, we're going to benefit from their interest in and really appreciation of intellectual history. And the material for this history is very intimate. It's the history of our department. So please welcome me and join me in welcoming Al and Steve to present the 2012 Tryon Lecture. Their title slide, I did have one picture of them. This is their title slide, and they're going to do it in 2 parts. Steve's going to speak first, again pass the baton on to Al, and then back to Steve, and then a general discussion. So welcome.
So I'm going to begin with an apology and a disclaimer. If anyone feels that their field has been slighted or that they have been personally ignored, they are surely correct. And we apologize. This single lecture could easily have been a course, and the deficiencies reflect what Al and I know and don't know. So, there's a lot that's not included, and I felt terribly today when I watched Ethel Musson walk in and realized, gee, I haven't talked about Paul in this lecture. And Paul and I had a wonderful year commuting from Berkeley to Palo Alto at the Behavioral Sciences Center in 1968-69. So a long time ago. Okay, my portions of this lecture have two components. What am I in? Wrong direction. Okay. And I start with the early history of the department. As some of you may know, I have an unnatural interest in the past. And I've spent a lot of time buried in the 19th century, and my technical capabilities are appropriate to that time. So I'm going to be talking about that today, the early history. And I was interested in the separation from philosophy and how psychology separated from that department. And I had a couple of questions when it started. I wondered why it took so long, because you didn't get an independent psychology department until 1922. And it turns out that wasn't really that long. A lot of departments took longer than that. And it's just that the history books are biased toward the departments that started first. Then the second question was, how did the philosophers feel about this? Were they happy to see the psychologists go? Were they worried about losing FTEs? What was going on? I mean, having been a department chair, those things pop into my head. And that question I'll come back to, but it's not an easy question to answer from what I've been reading. And then finally, Al's going to come up, and then I'll come back and talk about the development of biological psychology at UCB for particular reasons. Okay, let's see. So I'm going to start with George Holmes Harrison. And I should note that Harrison and Stratton had a really unusual relationship, and I'll be spending a lot of time on that. Harrison graduated from Marietta College in Ohio and got a master's degree there as well. And then he went to the Lane Theological Seminary. Lane Theological Seminary is an interesting place. A decade or two before Harrison got there, there had been a student revolt pressing for the abolition of slavery. And the trustees of the university, of the college, were very upset with all the publicity that this was drawing, and said, no, come on, students shouldn't be involved in things like that. There was actually another solution that was represented by a smaller group of students. They wanted to send all the slaves back to Africa. So there were these two alternative solutions. The trustees were not happy with any of this, and but that's the kind of place that Harrison went. And as we'll see, well, I think it prepared him for Berkeley. Then he was teaching mathematics and political economy then he was teaching mathematics and political economy at Washington University of St. Louis. And he wrote a textbook on analytic geometry. And that led him in turn to go to MIT, where he taught philosophy of science and ethics. And he taught that at Harvard as well. And then he went over to Europe to study, spent some time studying in Germany. I think that's where he may have picked up what Wundt was doing. Lectured in philosophy for a year at Michigan, and then was appointed the Mills Professor of Psychology at UC Berkeley in 1884. And he really not only started the department, but was its only professor for a number of years. And he taught every course in philosophy that was taught. And he developed a new psychology that was a new philosophy that was known as California personalism, to distinguish it from Boston personalism that was developed by a professor in Boston. And I am not sufficiently competent in 19th century idealistic philosophy to comment on this in any depth, but I will say that a good chunk of Howisson's life was spent trying to reconcile a real belief in religion and the immortality of the soul with science and evolution. And this is one of his major books, The Limits of Evolution, and it discusses the complexities. And I've often thought it would be fun to wake him up and let him read some of the recent atheistic arguments of Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. Howisson would have a lot to say. This is not alien territory to him, and it's one of those things where the more things change, the more they stay the same. There are enduring questions, and they're big questions. George Malcolm Stratton graduated from UC in philosophy, taught English and Latin in high school here in California. And Howisson is a really crucial mentor. And Howisson's mentoring is extraordinary. There are in the Bancroft Library 107 letters from Stratton to Howisson and 79 letters from Howisson to Stratton. And it is a remarkable record. It starts in his late student years, and it goes through his graduate years, and it goes through Howisson's, Stratton's coming back to Berkeley. Howisson arranges first for him to go to Yale and get a master's in philosophy, and then he returns to UC at Howisson's invitation, and then Howisson arranges for him to go study with Wundt and to get the money from the university to support a fellowship for his study with Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig. And then there's en route a summer in Cambridge with Hugo Munsterberg, who is one of the founders of applied psychology, and William James. And at this point, I'm going to do something, even though I'm going to run out of time, but I'm going to read excerpts from a few letters, because, excuse me? I need to get closer to the microphone? Further away. Oh, I'd love to be further away. Okay. You can't imagine how far away I'd like. At any rate, the letters capture these people in a way that I don't think reading any article can ever capture them. And I'll just read a couple of excerpts from the summer of 1890. I'll start with the summer of 1894, when Stratton has been introduced by Howisson to William James. And I have had only a 10-minute talk with Professor James, but what I saw was good. His conversation had the salt of his writing, and he was cordial and delightful with me. I thank you for the opportunity of consulting him. He advised me to take a summer course here and then hasten to Europe for my German until the University of Leipzig shall open. That is the place to go, he says, for psychology. And that's a remarkable thing for James to tell him, because In James' textbook of psychology, he talks about a microscopic psychology that has arisen in Germany and only could have developed in a country whose natives could not be bored. And so for James to tell him this is the place to go and study if you want to learn psychology, you would never know that from any history of psychology textbook. And then James tells him, I will not get much from Wundt himself. He is too busy. Yet I'll find a fine band of young men there who will help me. 11th of June, 1894. My dear professor, I have just telegraphed you about Professor James' kind invitation to live in his house during my stay here. Their invitation came in such a way, and he's there with his wife, and James, he's referring to James' wife as well. The invitation came in such a way that there could be no hesitation about accepting it. For Professor James made it seem to appear a favor to him, the skillful man. The house would be safer, etc., and he would rather we came than the student he had in mind to ask. The offer involved taking care of the lawn and house in exchange for rent. And Stratton asked Howison, basically says, is it okay if I do this? I've already accepted, but if you say I can't, I won't. And he sends him this telegram, and Howison reassures he would not have invited you if he did not mean to do so. So Stratton spends the summer of 1894 living in William James' house, and his next-door neighbor is Josiah Royce, and he becomes friends with him. It's a good summer. Now, the summer ends, and he gets, and I'm leaving out some stuff on Munsterberg that is interesting to people like me, but you don't need to know about. Letters from Leipzig, and I'm just going to give you a few. The first I'm going to quote is from the June of 1895, and Stratton has written to him telling him there will be money to buy instruments for a laboratory in Berkeley. Quote, what you tell me about the laboratory and other matters is, of course, a great satisfaction. So we are assured of having a laboratory. With the $800 or $900, we can get the most essential instruments, which are applicable in all sorts of experiments, and get those of more limited use later on. The instruments are, as you know, dreadfully expensive. Then the 12th of May. I have a little bit of news which shows that Wundt thinks well of my dissertation, and his dissertation is on the perception of changes of pressure at varying rates. It's not the work for which Stratton is famous. And of course, I am pleased and must tell you. And then he says something that's really, this is the kind of thing that makes reading these letters worthwhile. G. Stanley Hall is one of the founders of developmental psychology in the United States. It rises to great eminence in psychology. But this is the 12th of May, 1896. Hall's already famous. Did you see the short notice that Stanley Hall gave of the Royce address and the comments in the last American Journal of Psychology? It made my blood boil that a man could be so mean and, quote, smart, unquote. Hall doesn't look like such a Philistine. What is the matter with him anyway? Nichols', quote, charitable judgment of him is that he is insane, in the medical sense of that word. Now, part of what's interesting about this, if you get into the history of psychology, is that late in life, Hall would become critically engaged with religion. But at this point, if you go back to this article in 1896, the article is a critique of all these psychologists and philosophers who are so interested in God. And he's just furious with them. And he mentions Howison, which I think is what really makes Stratton's blood boil. 5th of June, 1896, thesis accepted summa cum laude. You'll rejoice with me, I feel sure. Affectionately, George Malcolm Stratton. 15th of July, 1896, and now things are getting tense because he has to get back to the United States. His fellowship's going to be up. The miserable examinations are over, I'm glad to say, and I passed them with more than enough to give me magna cum laude. Apologies for not doing better, but I don't seem to have the makeup which brings success at examinations. I didn't know enough about Hobbes and deep-sea fauna to suit the examiners. And what happens is that he really wants to be questioned on the nervous system, but they have nothing there that no one there will question on the nervous system. So he has to put zoology as his top area to be questioned. And that's what happens. So now I can go back to the other stuff, but it just feels, well, I just love the letters. So I've read about half of what's in the Bancroft, but there's a lot left to read. Now, so after he returns to Berkeley and he establishes a psychological laboratory here, you'll see that reflected in the course descriptions. He leaves Berkeley briefly to establish a laboratory at Johns Hopkins and then returns in 1908 for the remainder of his academic life, except for the years during World War I. I got this picture from Nicholas Wade's article in Perception in 2000, and he said, kindly supplied by the University of California, Berkeley. This is actually supplied by Karen Divilloy. An upright man, an upright, inverted, and combined view by George Malcolm Stratton. And this is his most famous work. The name of George Malcolm Stratton is known to almost every student of perception. He viewed the world with an upright retinal image and described his experiences over a period of days. It's actually 3 days indoors with a monocular inverted lens in Germany and 8 days here in Berkeley, walking around in the streets with binocular upside-down world. Gregory, 1998, has referred to it as perhaps the most famous experiment in the whole of experimental psychology. Stratton's approach, and he goes on, talks about Stratton's approach being influenced by Howison, and then he notes the books he wrote on culture, religion, and social conflict appear to have made relatively little impression. Stratton's name lives on within perception for his studies of vision with an upright visual image. And within the history of science and translation of Theophrastus, and you know, as somebody who spent a lot of time here teaching history of psychology, you go back to Stratton's original description of his course in history of psychology, and you realize he's doing all these translations from Latin and Greek on his own. He is not, and he's putting it out there for the unwashed people, and actually writes this wonderful history of Theophrastus, who got things right, had things in the brain when Aristotle still had things in the heart. And finally, Wade closes with, has history treated Stratton as well as he served history? He's a lovely, impressive man. And this was one of his first books. It's a book in social psychology. 1903 is the original date of publication. And then he writes this, and it's connected with Howison and this book is truly remarkable, and it's a study in comparative cultures from a psychological point of view. And he's considering Christianity and Muslim culture and so forth. It's really quite an extraordinary book. He's doing questionnaires and all kinds of interesting things, but it's not where psychology is going. And one of the things you pick up in the correspondence between Howison and Stratton is a disappointment that psychology is treating and studying what can be studied rather than what's really important. And it's there in their correspondence. And I think, gee, I'm not sure you would feel better now, but I don't know. Course of Instruction, 1885-86. I wouldn't be surprised if you would find the same thing in 1884-85, the year that Howison came, but that's missing from the Bancroft Library catalog. The pages are actually missing. Here's philosophy. Introduction to Philosophy, Empirical Psychology. involving formal logic, deductive and inductive general history of philosophy, and it's taught by Professor Howison, as is everything in philosophy at that time. Courses of instruction, now I'm going to jump a few years. In 1891, Howison gets a Playmates. He's invited George Stratton back from teaching high school to help him teach psychology in Berkeley. Philosophy 2 is now described as elementary psychology. And you look at the description, the general nature and the classification of the facts of consciousness and their relation to neural physiology, Howison and Stratton. That definition is taken directly from William James, whose textbook had come out in 1890. So the description has changed, and now it's psychology. 1896, 97, you get a psychological laboratory added for the first time. Stratton has come back from his time with Wundt, but he still doesn't have his Ph.D. Now he has his Ph.D., and the number of courses increases, and they're all taught by Stratton. Howison's gone back to philosophy. Elementary, general, introductory psychology, and the conference is really a research course for students who want to get engaged in research. Applied psychology. And I just put this up because religion was not a minor issue for these people. So when Brown teaches applied psychology in 1919, certain results of modern psychology bearing upon the work of the lawyer, the physician, the teacher, and the businessman. But when Stratton teaches it, results of modern psychology bearing on the work of the lawyer, the physician, the teacher, the clergyman, and the merchant. I mean, it's really on these people's minds. It is not a minor issue for them. By the way, they began teaching applied psychology here as early as 1909. And as we'll see, it becomes a big part of the future of psychology at Berkeley. So in 1921-22, the departments had still not split, but courses were listed separately. And there were 5 professors of philosophy, or 4, I'm not sure about Prahl, and 4 professors of psychology. And Olga Bridgman, the first woman, is appointed. A very interesting appointment in 1915. She comes here in 1915 and gets appointed to the faculty with an MD. And they question her and say, why do you want to get a PhD also? She says, I want it. Let me do it. But she begins teaching right away on basically abnormal aspects of child development. And she's working in the criminal courts and all kinds of interesting stuff. Separate budgetary requests and justification from the 2 departments in 1918, 1919. And I wanted to read that to you. The chair's letter. This is actually, the letter is written, this letter that I have is written in the 1920s, so that may be a mistake. The philosopher's request. No change in the number of faculty since 1908, 1909, despite an instructional burden increasing 3.5 times from 2000 to 2,000 as against 600 in 10 years. That's why we need 2 more faculty. Listen to the basis for increasing the size of the psychology department at this time. Psychologists request expansion, A, that the same work that we are now doing may be done more effectively. Not a powerful argument. I wouldn't advise Rich to try it. B, that we may expand the direction of the wider application of psychology which the public is demanding, and that this counteracts some of the false and pseudo-psychology which is at present being broadcast. and psychology requests 3 new positions and gets none of them. An associate professor of business psychology, an associate professor of educational psychology, and an instructor in clinical psychology, 50% appointment in psychology and 50% in the med school. So that's the history of this. And finally, in 1922, the department split, and you have the psychology faculty, George Stratton, Olga Bridgman, Warner Brown, and Edward Tolman, who came in 1918. And now the Tolman era. For you, Al.
All right. I'm not nearly as much fun, but I'll do my best to be serious. Now I have a lapel mic. What happens when I walk away from the? Can you hear me in the back of the room? All right. So it doesn't make any difference where I stand. So I'm going to move this up like this. I'm going to. My talk is in 2 or 3 parts. Let's see. How do I do this? What do I do to make it move?
No one's ever asked me to be a technical expert.
Yeah, right, but go ahead. Okay. All right. So the talk is in 2 or 3 parts. The first part is really some pictures that I want to show of old friends and family and things like that. But I wanted to say, I came here in 1950. I came in the middle of the loyalty oath, about which I knew nothing. It turns out it was a big deal. And I had been assured, I called the chair of the department, C.W. Brown, whose picture will appear up there, and was assured that it was all over. I thought that was fine. I didn't know much about it, but I was glad they'd settled it. I got out here and discovered that it was still raging along, and that Edward Tolman and a couple of other people, Hubert Stanley Coffey and Nevitt Sanford, had all been fired because they refused to sign the loyalty oath. The loyalty oath was a special oath that said, not only are we not communists, which we've already said in the state loyalty oath, but we're really not communists. and those 3 faculty members from psychology and a fair number of other people, maybe a dozen, 15, 20 around the campus, refused to sign. The rest of the faculty stayed on, and I must say, performed properly. They supported the non-signers. It lasted, I thought it lasted 3 or 4 years. A letter which I shall read says about 2, but we'll see. Anyhow, those were the situation in which I arrived. I arrived and was put into a course that was most interesting. It was taught primarily, the lead person was Warner Brown, who, as you saw, was an early member and was the first real chair of the department when the department was formed. And Leo Postman, who came the same year I did, and Reem Jarrett, who was here, who was a statistician. And the 4 of us taught this course for honors students. It had 60 people in it. It met 9 hours a week. And we did experiments and ran experiments and gave lectures, and it was a marvelous course. And I got to know Warner very well, and became his very good friend, and remained so until he died a few years later. And it was a terrific way to come into the department, because I was associated with some splendid minds and had lots of guidance, and it was quite wonderful. And so I'll read. And then Edward Tolman came back a year or so later, and I took his seminar, and I'll come to that in just a moment. Let's see what shows here. That's what I wanted to come to. This is quite wonderful, I think. This is a picture, an early picture of Warner Brown. He's the fellow over on the right. And this is a performance, as it says down here, of Ajax by Sophocles, and it was given in the Greek theater, and in Greek. And the gentleman here on the left, who looks like something out of Monty Python, is Monroe Deutsch, who became the provost of the university, which was in effect like the present academic vice chancellor. He ran the university for Robert Gordon-Sproul, who was the president, but there he is back in his heyday, and I just think that's a really quite a wonderful picture. I've always loved it. And the next picture here, there's more family, is a picture of a gathering of Warner Brown and his students, I think about 1922, because the young woman right next to Warner down there is Ellen Brown, who was his daughter and was I know exactly how old she was. She was 10 years old. And I put this in here to call attention to her. Ellen is the person who refurbished the Warner Brown room about 25 years ago, and at considerable expense, and she was a patron and a lover of this department. She became a professor of medicine and circulatory physiology over at the medical school, and was a good and close friend of mine all her life. More pictures. This, I think, is choice. This is a picture of the Western Psychological Association in, I think, what it says there, 1935. And we put the names in there so you can tell who they are. And it's a lovely thing. And of course, the star of the show is up there in the middle. It's Shirley Temple. And this is Mrs. Temple here next to Warner Brown. And the gentleman over there in the sports jacket, who's not properly dressed, is George Temple, Shirley's dad. And next to him is Howard Gilhausen, who was a student of Warner's who went to UCLA and was on the faculty there. And over in the corner is Egon Brunswick. Two heads above him is Edward Tolman. And it's a distinguished crew. And we could go through and name them all, but I'm not going to take the time. But I wanted to point out the man with the big smile there, right in here, that's Smiling Jack Hilgard. And that's what folks used to call him, was Smiling Jack. He always looked like that. He was a wonderful guy. And he was, I think, a splendid psychologist. He had style and imagination, and he was a lovely person. And that's a fine picture of him. And the others we could talk about, but I'm not going to. And the next I put in, just because I loved her so much. This is Olga Bridgman as an older woman. She was just wonderful, and she was half-time in the department. She was half-time in the department, half-time in the medical school, and was the person in the Bay Area for child pathology. She was the expert. And was an adornment to the department in many ways, I think. I threw this in because I like it. The picture down there shows Jessie Brown. This is my handwriting, so you'll have to excuse it. And George Stratton. And I think the woman talking to them is probably Iris Jarrett. And then the woman under the parasol there is Jean McFarland, and I'm not sure who the other woman is. I haven't been able to figure that out. But this is in Warner's backyard over on Regal Road at the corner of Regal and Marin, where he moved just about that time. Before that, the Brown family lived over on not Benvenue, but Hillegas. And a minor thing about Warner, who I was enormously fond of. Warner was educated at home. He was whatever they called it back then, and came out here. His family brought him out here to Berkeley in about the turn of the century to go to college. And so he went to college here, and then he was sent off to Columbia to get a Ph.D. with Robert S. Woodworth, and then he came back and joined the faculty and stayed here. That's the way it worked. That's just a nice picture of Warner in his backyard, and I'm going to slide past that and get on with the meat of the talk. This I put in because I think it's so wonderful. Our Indiana Jones. This is Edward Tolman, and it's just it goes along with some of those other wonderful pictures of a choice guy. And I will say this: I'm going to talk a fair amount about Edward for a couple of minutes, because not because I liked him so much, which I did, but because he had such a powerful impact on the intellectual development of this department. And the effect was absolutely enormous, and I don't think anyone could have predicted it. I mean, everyone knew, he must have known early on that he was a very smart guy, but that isn't what gave him the power of his impact. His early career, he graduated from MIT, where his father was on the Board of Regents, or whatever they called it, and his older brother had gone there and was a star, and so Edward had decided early on that he couldn't be a physicist because he wasn't as smart as his brother, and he would be overshadowed by him, and so he thought he'd be a philosopher, and he went off and took a philosophy course and a psychology course at Harvard the year he graduated from MIT, and discovered that he wasn't smart enough to be a philosopher either. And he says all this, I mean, I'm not making this up. And so he decided to become a psychologist. He said he thought he was smart enough for that, and it suited his purposes and his temperament. But he was powerfully affected by what he learned from the philosophy people, and it pervades his psychology all the way through. So he got his Ph.D. and went off to Northwestern and stayed there 3 years, and got, in effect, got fired. And there are three reasons that were floated around and that were mentioned. One of them was that they were retrenching, which is, and the second is that he wasn't a very good teacher, which was probably true. He describes himself as unhappy in class, confused, diffident, awkward, ill at ease, and that probably was all true, even though the brilliance, I'm sure, came through. But he said he was hell-bent on being a research professor. That's what he wanted. But there was a third thing. He was a pacifist. And he had written stuff in an anti-war paper. And the guy who was the president of Northwestern was a militarist, a prominent one. And he speculates that that might have had something to do with the fact that they let him go. And it probably, almost certainly was. And through some great fortune, Berkeley had the sense to hire him. And he came out here in 1918, and I tried to find, very hard tried to find letters that would say what had gone on, who wrote about him, and I've looked everywhere and can find no letters, but one can tell something very interesting about what was going on from looking at his early publications. And this is an outline of what I'm going to say, and you can see we're at early publications. What did they predict? And I'm going to go here. I don't know whether you can read this or not. Can you read it? I'll tell you what it says, because it's so interesting, and it's the first 3 or 4 or 5 things in here, down to about here, are what he was doing and publishing about the time he came, and probably was the research he was doing at Northwestern. And I'm going to read them so that you get a flavor of what he was thinking about. The first one says, more concerning the temporal relations of meaning and imagery, Psych Review. The next one says, retroactive inhibition as affected by conditions of learning. The third says, a note on association time and feeling. The next says, nerve process and cognition. And the fifth one says, English and mathematical abilities of a group of college students. And this has almost nothing to do with what he did for the rest of his life. It's as though a curtain got drawn, and And if one only knew that about him, one would have had absolutely no way of predicting how he spent the rest of his intellectual life. So he arrived here and was told, well, figure out what you'd like to teach. And he had taken this course back at Harvard from Yerkes on comparative psychology, and he says, I think I'll teach comparative psychology. And he used Watson's textbook on comparative psychology. And of course, he immediately started to fight with it. And from then on, the publications get more and more interesting as he was doing several things. One thing he was doing, he was fighting against dualism. He was a monist. And psychology at that time was still concerned with the relationship, not whether people introspect, but the relationship between body and mind. And he was certain that anything that could be said about introspection was a property of behavior, and that what people called mind and introspection were what he's called immanent in behavior, meaning a property of, lying in. He hadn't arrived at the notion of intervening variables yet, and he thought, what, you just observe behavior, you can observe it talking or whatever, but that's it. And so you see these interesting things start to happen in here, instinct and purpose. And he was very interested in the idea that there were inherited properties that controlled the way behavior works. He was not a radical empiricist at all. And then a new formula for behaviorism. A behavioristic account of emotions. The inheritance of Maeve's learning abilities in rats. And this is pre-Tryon, I might point out. And it is an experiment in which he segregated rats on the basis of performance in maze. He set up the conditions that Tryon used so effectively in his work. And I mean, there's no question. Tryon is the inheritance guy, and he established the field, but Tolman had those ideas before Tryon ever appeared on the scene. And then they continue. Behaviorism and purpose. Purpose and cognition. A behavioristic theory of ideas. Habit formation and higher mental processes. A behaviorist definition of consciousness. All wrestling with this mind-body problem, among other things. And then purposive behavior in Psych Review. And then a series of things here with Charlie Hanzik on insight in rats and the beginning of the latent learning things, and that comes up down here, and here's his great book, but there are other things in there that I have neglected to put in there that I should have, Irv, and I'm sorry that I don't have it in there, but we all know it's there, and that is his work on latent learning with Irvin's friend down at Texas, whose name escapes me at the moment. Thank you, Hugh Carlton Blodgett, and so there was an awful lot going on here. Now, and it was the interesting thing about it is the enormously programmatic, focused aspect of it, that he was building a system, and I must say it was revolutionary. There was nothing like it that would have predicted it. There were some philosophers who talked about some of these things, but there was nothing really like it in the experimental literature that would have predicted this, and it was totally different in its style, in the units of description of what he thought was being learned, and he was fighting not only dualism, but he was fighting Watson, who he thought was merely concerned with twitches and with reflexes. He was fighting Thorndike, who thought learning consisted of the association of stimuli and responses, and that were strengthened by the. He put it so interestingly. He said it's as though he thinks that a reward squirts a little juice into the connection, and he said that's not the way it happens at all. And he had this very radical idea that what was being learned was the arrangement of organism-environment relationships, the rearrangement of relationships between the organism and the environment. And he had a wonderful way of developing neologisms, and they're all the way through his writing. He also talked about these ways of learning as sign gestalt expectations, that there are signs out there, they lead to expectations, but the word gestalt in there was terribly important to him because it was about organizational expectations. And he got this idea in part from a visit that he made to Germany when he was a graduate student. How am I doing on time? I could rattle on for a long time, and I don't want to do that. I'm going to cut this short about Tolman, but I wanted to make 2 or 3 points. I'll finish what I was going to say. He got it in Germany. He spent 2 summers in Kurt Kafka's lab in Germany, and the first one he was a graduate student, the second after he'd been out 2 or 3 years. So Tolman had a spectacular 10 or 15 year run in there, and he had a profound impact on the department because the students flocked to him. Half of the PhDs between 1925 and 1935 or 40 were Tolman's, and the rest of them were distributed among Stratton and Brown and Harold Jones, who was here by then, and Gene McFarland, who was on the faculty from 1929, and Olga Bridgman. The rest of them were distributed among them, but half of them were Tolman's. And some of those students went on to have brilliant careers and probably deserve a special mention. One of them was Tryon, that we've already talked about him enough, and that's great. And the other was Kresh, who had, I think, a remarkable career and was a remarkable person. And Kresh started out life as Isidor Krashevsky, and he changed his name when he had a child. He said, "I'm not going to saddle my young son with that complicated name," and he changed it to David Kresh. But all his early publications are I. Krashevsky, and I wanted to say 2 or 3 things about him. One is that he was a loyal person. His friends loved him. His enemies hated him. I once recall going to Kresh when I wanted him to come out and campaign for Adlai Stevenson the second time around, and he said, "I only spit hot." And he wouldn't do it. He'd done it the first time, didn't work, he wasn't going to do it again. And this was very characteristic for him. And I also should say that I just had a letter from Richard Kresh yesterday asking if he could donate a couple of Kresh's paintings to the department. And I haven't told the chairman yet. I said, I can't give that permission because I'd have no power, but I'm sure that they'll take them. And he said Kresh painted them on 2 successive days of views of the Campanile from their house, which was up there. And it struck me as so characteristic of him that he could do 2 paintings that were worth keeping, 1 a day in 2 days. He also was very good at lightning chess, and wasn't a very good chess player apparently, but was a wizard at lightning chess. That was the way he was. He had 3 major hits. He was the first person in rats to investigate selective attention. He called it hypotheses in rats. I won't go into that, but I could talk about it at great length, and I won't. The second thing was that he and Richard Crutchfield wrote the first honest-to-God theoretical book about social psychology that had a Gestalt bias to it. And the third thing was that he and 3 of his colleagues started work on brain biochemistry and behavior, and he started it. I mean, he couldn't have done it without the others, but he was the rainmaker, I think. Tolman's effect was enormous. I haven't said much about the loyalty oath, but I think I said enough. I want to finish talking about Tolman by reading a letter. And I must say, I've tried to read it 2 or 3 times, and I get choked up, so I won't read it. Maybe after we finish, I can. It's great. It's from Robert Gordon Sproul explaining how much he loved Tolman, and what a fool he was to get rid of him, and bring him back, and so forth. It's a great letter. If I can do it, I will. So I wanted to say this about Tolman. He had an enormous impact on the department. He changed its direction. He was also one of the most modest, self-effacing, childish, wonderful people I have ever known. World War II came along. All these guys left. Tolman and Kresh and Tryon and Crutchfield and Bellacci, who was here, and Reed Tuddenham and C.W. Brown and Eddie Gazzelli all went off to war. And 3 or 4 of them went into the Air Force and things like that, but the majority of them, Tryon and Tolman and Kresh and Crutchfield and Bellacci, all went to what was called the Office of Strategic Services. And the Office of Strategic Services was built by a guy named Wild Bill Donovan, who was a military guy, and he hired the man whose painting is back there, the second painting, not this one. He hired Harry Murray from Harvard, a psychiatrist, who was his lead psychologist, and he hired Bob Tryon to be one of his area heads, and this gentleman here, Donald McKinnon, to be another, and started this business where they tried to figure out how you pick a good spy. That's what it was all about. How you select, what are the characteristics that make a good spy, and how do you find out? And they developed kind of in situ personality tests where they would have cocktail parties or do strange and wonderful things and see what people do, and in an attempt to find out what makes good spies, and it must have been a lot of fun, and so the department shrunk. I'm watching that clock back there now very carefully, because I can see people are going to leave. The department shrunk from 11 people to 4 people during the war. After the war, the department expanded. All those people came back, and about twice as many more people were hired between 1945 and 1955 in all areas. And so that there was an explosion in the social personality area, including the hiring of Don McKinnon, and all that gang came back from OSS and established the Institute of Personality Assessment and Research. And it became a major force in this department. And at the same time, the clinical program was expanding like mad, and they hired 3 or 4 people, but Gene McFarland, who was the lead clinical person, also had a grant from Public Health to hire people to train clinical psychologists. And that was a set of 4 people who were here for maybe 5 years, and I'll mention their names, merely because some of you may know them. Shirley Hecht, who is still around town and was one of my favorite people, I think, of the department of all time, and Erica Weingarten, who was also around town for a long time, and Merv Friedman, who went over to San Francisco State, and Timothy Leary, who went on to great fame. But there were others. It was a large group, so there was a large personality group, a large social group, a large clinical group, and when I came, the year I came in 1950, 4 people in experimental psychology were hired in the same year. Leo Postman, Mark Rosenzweig, Benbow Ritchie, and Al Riley were all hired the same year. We were presumably hired to do different things, and most of us ended up doing something else. And that's it. I could talk about that, but I don't have time. I'm running out of time, and you're probably running out of patience. And I want to say the upshot of all this was an enormously important thing in the future of the department. The expansion of the student body, graduate student body, by 6-fold, the undergraduate body by 2.5 to 3 times, the faculty from 4 to 11 to about 30, just caused impossible strains on the department. Fights over philosophy, where the department was going, what had to happen, who was going to get hired next, where the space was coming from, where the money was coming from. And finally, after 5 or 6 years of this, a group of the young people in experimental said, we think, this is a polite way to put it, we think the department will be a much better place if we get out. So they attempted to secede and petitioned the administration to have a different department, and they said, whoever they were, we will give the name of psychology to our friends that we're leaving, and we will call ourselves something else. And the administration had a select committee, and the select committee said no, and they said go back and behave. But they also said you can divide the department up into some appropriate structure that allows autonomy. And so the department split into 3 parts. Then not only did they not have lunch with each other, but they hired separately. They appointed, they were promoted to tenure separately. And of course it didn't work, but it did one very, very good thing. It brought peace, and the peace was terribly important, and it went on for several years, with the administration getting increasingly restive at these 3 groups going in funny directions, and finally, when one of the previous chairs was one of my favorite people of all time, quit in high dudgeon over something. Harrison Goff came in and was told in a very nice way by the administration that they hoped he would be able to do something to reduce the independence of these groups and make them start behaving more like a department. And that was his job. And he did it very well, and he reduced the autonomy of the groups, but didn't get rid of them, but set the stage for the next chair whose clear mandate it was to get rid of them, and Jeffrey Keppel did. And those 2 guys completely transformed the department with lots of help, internal help, because by that time the department realized that this was a bad idea and it wasn't working. So they had lots of support, but they also had lots of opposition. And they were a couple of young, brave people who did us very well. So why are these things important? Well, they're important from the standpoint of thinking about how a structure emerges, because after the tripartite thing, when Jeffrey had finally eliminated them completely, it was possible to have almost any structure you wanted. And the structures have changed a lot through the years since then, because there are no built-in groups. There are no groups that have a proprietary interest in the way that those tripartite groups did. And so the modern department, I think, was able to emerge, and probably couldn't have if that didn't happen. And let's see if there's anything else I want to say. There are, of course, many things that could be said. As Steve said, this should be a semester course, and we want you people to come to every lecture, but it can't be. And so there are all sorts of people that should be mentioned that I haven't mentioned, all sorts of issues that should have been raised that haven't been raised. But I'm going to stop there. Now that I've kind of regained control of myself, I'm going to end by reading this letter. Dear Professor Tolman, with the end of the academic year 1953-54, I was reminded that the time for your retirement from active service on the university faculty has arrived, and mirabile dictu, that 36 years have passed since you came to Berkeley as an instructor in the Department of Psychology, a chronological fact which I find hard to believe, for you look as young to me as you did on that first day. Be that as it may, no one can gainsay that in these 36 years you have borne a titan share in bringing your department to a position of eminence in the academic world. The impress of your genius has been left upon it long before the recent unhappy break in continuity. This, I should add that this comes from the president. In continuity that deprived us of your services for 2 years, and this and your fame has spread with you wherever social sciences are known. This encomium from an ignorant administrator is confirmed and attested by the honors that have come to you from sources of the highest competence to judge, that is the National Academy of Science and the faculty of the University of California, which named you as faculty research lecturer, the highest award at its disposal. To attempt to add my might to the list is perhaps an act of supererogation, but I cannot forbear, even in this necessarily brief farewell, to express the university's gratitude to you for all you have meant to it. And may I add, it is my hope, shared by your colleagues, that you'll continue to do so and so. Yours sincerely, Robert Gordon Sproul. This can be read both as a grateful thanks and as an abject apology. It's both. Thank you. Oh, and if there's time, is there time? We're open for questions. Steve. Oh, you're not through. Come on up.
I could be through.
No, no, no.
Oh, I really could be through. Let me go to the... Oh, there are all those wonderful pictures that...
It's okay.
Okay.
It's a great picture of Crash.
Where am I going? So these are the additional things that you wanted in here, Al. You want me to keep going?
Just go right ahead. That's a picture.
Oh, you want to say something about...
Yes, they were celebrated adversaries. They used to make Jean McFarland cry in faculty meetings. And she was a formidable fighter. And that's just a wonderful picture of the two of them. Really, it shows their character. And there's another picture in there of Kresh, which I love because it shows him in all his ferocity. But we don't have to see it.
Is that back further?
No, that's that one.
That one,
That's
yes.
The young Kresh. And I just think it's pure Kresh.
Okay. I didn't put that in.
Go back. Go back.
Well, the only thing I can say...
That's my last picture.
That's Al's last picture, and I did find it more fun than lecturing, but that's just life. Now, Al asked me to do this next section, and it changed as... first of all, I didn't see why biological psychology should have been selected, particularly out of all the different kinds of psychology. But it was an interesting task because of the following. There was a time in psychology that local students would probably have trouble recognizing. Between about 1930 and the mid-1950s, when there was almost no focus on the neural substrates of behavior. It was just ruled out of the discipline by Skinner and Tolman, and to some extent Hull. It was just not there. And this article by Tolman is actually one of my favorite things. Tolman's just playing, I think. And he's talking about, this is 1938, he's talking about reductionism, and he's saying, that's silly. Why should we be trying to reduce things? What's important is the most comprehensive explanation, not going down there to the nervous system. And the most comprehensive explanation for our kind of work is sociology. And psychology has to rely on sociology in order to do its work. And then you look down there, and there are those physiologists, and they have to look up at us to do their work. So he's just playing and having a wonderful time, and it's a little known piece, but I really enjoyed it. Now, what I'm going to do is I have a set of letters here. Of course, I like letters, and I'm going to go to the last one. No. And what's happened is that Lashley has died. And my major professor, Donald Hebb, is supposed to write a necrology for the American Journal of Psychology. And he writes to Tolman and Skinner and says, was it Lashley's work that frightened you away from physiologizing? And Lashley had done all these studies in which he couldn't find the place in the brain where the memory trace was located. And so, that's not me, is it? At any rate, so there's a wonderful letter from exchange of letters between Tolman and Hebb about all this. And Tolman says, no, I sort of like Lashley, particularly the study where he teaches a monkey to grasp a reward with one arm, and then he makes a lesion in the part of the motor cortex that controls that arm, and the monkey just comes in and reaches with the other arm. The monkey has cognition going on up there. And he says, and also, I certainly was an anti-physiologizer at that time, and I'm glad to be considered as one then. Today, however, I believe that this physiologizing is where the great new breakthroughs are coming, and to you belongs much, much of the credit. And he signs it. My real animus was against Watson's atom-like stimuli on the one side and his muscle twitchism on the other. And I should say that this is 1958. In 1954, the relationship between Hebb and Tolman was very good. And in 1954, okay, I'm so undisciplined. In 1954, well, 1953, they had Tolman out, Hebb out to Berkeley to spend the summer here. And in 1954, Hebb had gotten Tolman, one of his main adversaries in the field, because of the anti-neurologizing, an honorary degree at McGill. And then they became friends, and when Tolman is trying to get back pay after he's reinstated at Berkeley from the loyalty oath, he writes to Hebb, and I have that letter. It's in personal handwriting. It's not a typed letter. And he said, my lawyers would like it if you could get me the citation, because that will convince people I'm really a significant figure, and it'll help me get back pay. This is embarrassing to write this to you, and if you can't do it, I understand. And Hebb writes to him and says, I'll do it. Don't worry. And he sends him the citation and everything. And their relationship is very personal and very good, and that precedes what's going on here. So let me do a bit more. And that's Hebb writing back to him and telling him how much he appreciates the letter that Tolman has sent. And he said, and you've taught me things about the mind and purpose and intervening variables and things like that, which physiologists really need. Now, how did biopsychology get reestablished at Berkeley in the 1950s? And one of the things that comes up is that Tolman's character was such that he was so open. And also David Kretsch changed fields and started this research with Mark Rosenzweig, who was newly appointed. And then these other people were appointed. Gilbert French was here from 57 to 67. He came from Harry Harlow's lab, and he made frontal lobe lesions in monkeys. And he went back to South Dakota, and he just died last month. I happened to have read his obituary and trying to track these people. But what I'm interested in is how these people were, in particular, I'm going to focus on senior hires, because it has to do with the hiring of women in this department in the end. And it's a very interesting kind of story. So that's Ed Bennett, Marion Diamond, David Kretsch, and a youthful Mark Rosenzweig. This is a letter from Tolman to Hebb in 1954. Dear Don, you promised to write to tell me the situation at McGill. Have you found out enough now to drop me a line? We would appreciate it. Edward. Hebb writes back, the dice were rolled and only came to rest 2 days ago. I am pleased to write today. I plan to write today. I shall be staying here at McGill. It is rather hard to say those decisive words, but there they are. Please tell Eddie and Dave that I haven't the nerve to write to them. Yours, split personality-wise, D.O. Hebb. Dear Don, your note made me sad. But I'm pleased for you if that is what you want. In any event, you're a swell guy. And I wish there was some way in which we could see you oftener. I showed your note to Eddie and Dave, and they felt as badly as I. Yours to Freedom in Canada. And that reflects what happened around that 1954 loyalty oath and Tolman's departure and things like that. But what's fascinating about this offer is that Al Riley and Mark Rosenzweig knew nothing about it. The way things were done was that David Kretsch and Ed Ghiselli had been in graduate school and were postdocs with Lashley and New Beach and Hebb forever. And they said, oh, you know, let's get Hebb out here. And the rest of the department didn't know, including critical people like Mark. I mean, I talked to Mark Rosenzweig about it, and he didn't know that this was going on at all. So there was an old boys club that was really, it wasn't just all the men in the department, it was a very tiny fraction of the men in the department that would go out and do something like this, and the rest of the department wouldn't know until an announcement was sent around, guess who we hired? So let me indicate how I think Beach got hired. Oh gosh, I'm always... This is an article called The Chicago Five. This was published a few years ago by Don Dewsbury. A group of integrative psychobiologists, including Frank Beach, Donald Hebb, David Kretsch, Norman R.F. Meyer, and Theodore Schnerler, all of whom worked with Carl Lashley at the University of Chicago during 1929 to 1935. What happens then is that Lashley gets invited to Harvard, moves to Harvard, and Hebb goes along with him, and Ed Ghiselli joins him there. So you have a group of psychologists, powerful guys here at Berkeley. Kretsch, Ghiselli, and Tolman, and they begin going down the list of their friends. And first they go to Donald Hebb, and then when he doesn't come, in 1957-58, they invite Frank A. Beach. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't a good hire. Beach is quite a spectacular person, and Irv Zucker and I, in particular, owe him a great deal. But the way in which the hiring was done was changing very, very slowly. By the time that Beach was hired, Al remembers, you didn't vote on it, I take it. But what you remember is that Jerry McLaren and Tom Cornsweet went down to talk with him. And Gil French went down to talk with him at the Behavioral Sciences Center where Beach spent 57, 58. But that was the way hiring was done. And what that meant was there weren't many women in the department, and that's what I was going to get to next. Patterns of hiring and women in the department. Olga Bridgman, Jean McFarlane, 1915, 1929. And then there's a modest gap. Eleanor Roche, 1971. Christina Maslach, 1971. Rona Weinstein, 73. Mary Main, 73. And Sue Irvin Tripp, who made a lateral transfer in 1975. When did you first come to campus?
I was a visitor in this department in 58, 59.
Visitor in the department.
Yeah.
And when did you actually get on the faculty in?
And then I went into the speech department.
Okay.
We didn't have a graduate program.
At any rate, it's instructive to look at this, and and I think that the hiring of Beach, and the hiring, you can just, it's gradualism all the way. And so by the time the people are being hired in the 1960s, the whole department is involved in the voting. This is under Harrison's reign. The whole department is involved in the voting, but the nominations and the selections are still taking place in the groups to some extent. And it isn't until you get till the 1970s that you really get the department functioning as a whole, and you can correct me on.
Well, what I think about the 1970s was
Yes.
that the administration had pointed out that under the Civil Rights Act, they better get their act together.
Well, Al, do you want to address what Harrison told you?
Yeah, I asked Harrison about this explicitly because it's such an interesting issue as to where the pressure came from. And Harrison, whether he's got it right or not, I don't know, but his view is, he said, I received no pressure from the administration. The pressures were internal. The department wanted it. Now that's what he said. And so, but of course you don't know, there were so many things going on at that time. I think it's very hard to say what all the factors might have been, but that's his recollection.
Yeah, and it also could have been that people of the department were well aware of a change in the culture.
Yeah.
And it's not just a change in the UC Berkeley culture. There's a change, as in Tolman's first, my slide from Tolman, there's a change in the sociology of our times.
Well, don't forget our report on the status of women came out in 69, 70.
Yeah.
In the Senate, our Senate report.
Yeah.
So it was very public discussion about this
Sure.
topic.
Sure. Yeah, what I was leading into it just through how restricted the influences on hiring were in the 50s. It was, yeah.
Well, one of the big shifts was the writing of letters to chairs of the department across the country advertising a position. And then national ads came in, and then a monitoring process to see how many women applied
Right.
or did not apply for a position and how many women were hired. 22% of the graduates, Ph.D. graduates of the program during this era were women. 22% during this time.
The advertising came in with the affirmative action program, which wasn't until around 72, 73. So the department was a little ahead of that.
Al, why don't you stand up here? This is, Or are you enjoying sitting?
I was enjoying sitting, as a matter of fact.
And our friend Steve Palmer's raised his hand.
I'm going to pass around the microphone.
So it would be interesting to hear how Al Riley and Steve Glickman got hired and whether the department knew about those hires or not.
Well, and there was enough time elapsed so that it does present a contrast, although certainly not perfection.
I can only guess. My guess is
I thought it
that.
was your advisor talked to the chair of the...
Sure, I can only guess at what happened, but I'm reasonably confident that it must have been that way, is that Eddie Gazzelli and Mason Hare were both in the Air Force training project and so on, down at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas, and their boss was a guy named Art Melton. Art Melton was my major advisor at Ohio State. What am I to think?
I was hired in 1963, and I believe I was the last hire on the Old Boy Network, where people had written to my thesis advisor, and I was hired by mail. I'd never been west of Chicago.
Yeah.
So I was hired without by the first group, but without a whole department vote. But after that,
Shelley Corchin was here at that time, right?
Shelley came in the same year.
Uh-huh.
But I was hired in that way by mail. But this whole procedure changed after that. And so the next hires were all done by national search, all done with at least group votes. No? Not yet?
That's right. True. Dan Slopin has told me that he was driving across the country on a vacation, and he got a call from Roger Brown that said, "You've got a job at Berkeley. That's where you're going." And I don't know, was he before you or after you?
And what was the year?
So that was about I think it must have been very close, but it was probably close in time. Slopin said he didn't even know anything about the negotiations, just Roger Brown made a deal with
And
here,
I
and he
would
got the
say
job.
that my hire, yes, there was a search, and the search resulted, as far as I know, in 2 candidates emerging. And so it was nothing like what people go through nowadays. The searches were still really restricted.
We had already decided, Steve, my memory was it was decided that we were going to hire you.
They can't, the man at the back is making noises. He wants you to speak into a microphone so that you can be heard.
Thank you.
Otherwise,
This is an old memory, of course, but I recall when we were discussing hiring, getting you here, and I think the decision was made to hire you before we had to go through with the search. And that's how it used to be.
Okay, a confession. I was a postdoc with Frank Beach between 1962 and 1964, and that was also arranged by an old boy network. What happened was that Donald Hebb was solicited, "Can you recommend a Miller Fellow at Berkeley?" And I was actually intending to go over to study with Robert Hind in Cambridge to learn about ethology. But then I would have had to make an application and do all those complicated things. And instead, I got this letter from the Miller Institute that had been arranged between Hebb and Beach. And they invite me to a postdoc for 2 years. So I just came out and did a postdoc for 2 years without ever writing anything about what I was going to do or filling out any applications. I mean, if the world feels different to a lot of people here, it's because the world is different.
So it's probably always, everyone feels it's a bit of a black box about how they get hired someplace. But of course, you are also sending students out into the world. So there you would have knowledge, like, for a while, for instance, Al, when you were having your first Ph.D. students and then looking to place them in jobs, how would you go about setting, and where did you notice some change in the way you actually sent your students out?
you usually get a letter from someone you knew. And advocate somebody, and if they were lucky, they'd get hired. But
So it was tended to be reactive instead of proactive.
yes, yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you both for just a wonderful history and for your use of pictures and letters and the time. I think it gives an incredible flavor to the development of the department, and it's very much appreciated. As we're talking, I appreciated how you brought up the issue of women. You know, in a 40-something history of not hiring a woman in the department, and we can talk about the issue of procedures. We can talk about anti-nepotism rules and structural reasons. We can talk about perceptions of women and potentially not being capable or as smart, and some of the constraints in terms of being married and having children and no mechanisms to deal with it. But one of the issues I think just important to raise is the nature of the work that was done in psychology with the absence of disparate voices. So no women during that era, except for the two who were the first two PhDs, Olga and Jean, and then Enrico Jones, the first African-American faculty member hired, whether and how the work would have differed and the development of the field would have differed. And of course, that's why what pushed all of the changes. And it was interesting to hear that Jean and Olga were clinical psychologists focused on children in applied settings, delinquency. So one wonders about the child, family, community focus that might have been. But we are products of our time, and I think one of the exciting things about Berkeley has been that so many men and women created mechanisms to change it. So we have some incredible history on this campus in terms of the Title IX work, in terms of the tenure document and the Office of Faculty Equity, in terms of work on child care, Shelley's most recent work, you know, as Vice Chancellor. We have amazing creativity among both men and women in terms of trying to change the field of psychology. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just one more question, because we have a reception downstairs, and want to invite you all to come down there, but take a few more comments.
I just, not a comment, just a question. What do you think that the fighting in the department, dividing into 3 units, had to do with possibly retarding and a scarcity of resources? Did that have anything to do with the slow evolution to hiring women, to slow evolution to breaking up, or do you think they really didn't have any, that scarce resources in the fights and the dividing into 3 had anything to do with the eventual evolution of the department?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have, I mean, I know I can't answer your question. What I can tell you is that Heb came back from his year here in 1953. I didn't get to McGill till 56. But Heb came back from his summer here, pardon me, in 1953. Saying wonderful things about Tolman and terrible things about the department. And he sort of, he practically advised me and other people at McGill don't have anything to do with that place. They spend all their time fighting with each other. And so that it was, I mean, it actually affected the way I negotiated for my own position. And I didn't want all those people who are fighting with each other to decide whether or not I should get to be a full professor. So they offered me a job as an associate professor, and I said, you give me a full professorship or I don't come. And I really wanted to come. So, you know, these things were, it was a complicated time. And as to why the groups formed, I mean, think of what happened with those groups. I mean, Al didn't mention it, but and correct me if I'm saying this incorrectly, but
I will.
I mean, one group was sort of biology and experimental, and the other group was clinical, personality, social. But group 3 was all the people who didn't want to be in group 1 or 2. I mean, there was no logical coherence. Shelley.
People in group 3 got along with each other and liked each other.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and the nice part was that they all liked one another. I mean, that's worth a lot. Yes.
I want to add one thing as a spouse at the time. We came in 55, and Paul came
Who are you, Ethel?
Who am I? I'm Ethel Musson. What's left of Paul. And Paul came on a Ford Fellowship to IHD, and he was invited by Harold and Mary Jones. His good friends were there, and they brought him in. And he had spent a summer with them in 53 and then came back in 55, and then was invited to stay on. And he had been in clinical, didn't want to be in clinical. He wanted to be in personality and child development. But at the time we came, and the old guard was still there, and you had just
I came in 50.
50, so you were part of the old guard for us. I was an outsider. I had other things, my profession, and I just got the dinner parties. And what was remarkable at the time, to amplify, not to amplify, but to contradict what you said, is that there was all the fighting that I heard about going on in the departmental meetings. But socially, everybody got together all the time. We had a regular round of dinner parties so that the people who fought over all of these issues nevertheless saw each other socially, and the wives, unless they were involved, like Jean Block and some of the others, didn't know or would not have known that there was this much animosity at the departmental level. We heard about people I heard from Paul that Sue was being considered, that Shelley was being considered. These were people we met or he met or something. But socially, they really did get along, at least as far as I could tell, for a number of years.
I'm going to remember that advice.
For the most part.
I just wanted to add a few quick words. Steve, your point about people hearing about the department and its fighting, and that reputation continued for 20, 30, 40 years. Even today, I'll run into people and say, "Oh yeah, Berkeley, are you guys still fighting?" I mean, and they remember the 3 groups and all that kind of stuff. And that's a legacy that we may not be aware of, but it's out there. The other thing I would like to say in terms of the search that led to Eleanor and myself being hired, that came after the report that Sue referenced, and that got a lot of attention in the press. And it was looking at how many women do we have, which departments have ever hired women, and there were a bunch of them that were 0 departments that had never, and then there were departments that had hired women and how long it had been since the last hire. And psychology was on the top of that list of having gone the longest of any department that had ever hired a woman. So it got all the publicity, I think. And I think it did influence Harrison and other people about that. Unfortunately, I don't have still the letter that he sent out to the chair of Stanford, where I was as a Ph.D. No, actually, it was a little bit better than that. But he was trying to figure out how to say, we are hiring in social and we would like to consider women, but without being very blunt about it, So he had some sort of phrase like, we are flexible with regard to sex. And, we didn't use the word gender in those days. But it was kind of a way of saying, we're aware of this, we're aware of the publicity that we've had, and so, consider this. When I think back on that time, though, to answer another question that came up, I think yours, about graduate students, there were a lot more jobs available in that day. It wasn't a question of would you get a job. The question was which one of the many jobs that were out there. And the faculty would never recommend one student against another for any position. So there was still a kind of almost paternalistic, well, this person sounds good for one of these, and I'll, you know, try and push this one for that. So that was still kind of happening. But to show you in terms of the issue around gender at that point, one of the people writing a letter for me wrote the letter without using a pronoun that would indicate who Chris was. And, you know, until the very end, I think someone, you know, and you'll think, you know, she'll be a good addition to your apartment or something like that, and there was a she in that. But it was really, you know, when you think about it, this was craziness, that we would have to kind of go to that length not to get people to think that I was female, because that would, you know, make my chances worse on that. So
one of the, I don't challenge anything that's been said. I'm sure it's correct. One of the things that I don't know, and if one were doing research on this would want to know, is what was going on in other major departments of psychology at the same time. I don't really know. I know that when I was at Ohio State, I think there was one woman on the faculty, and it was a large department.
I want to say something that would bring us back to the future, because this talk ended in '65.
Yeah.
And so a couple of years ago, we had our department's external review. We hadn't been reviewed in many years. It's supposed to happen every 8 or 9 years. And in writing a long document with consultation with the faculty, it was suggested that we have a sort of 50-year history of hiring. So I did 1967, 77, 87, 97, 2007 for the review that took place late in that year. And I thought, well, I'll make a graph. And it was an interesting baseline, because in 1967, which I wish this talk had happened before I did that, there were 0% women and 0% minorities on the faculty. And of course, any change is infinite when your base is 0. But then from 67 to 77, and each decade till 2007, and it's probably similar now, even a little higher, 45% women and 22% minorities. And just to see that 50-year change, now seeing it in the backdrop of the history you've provided, is remarkable. And it would be great to do 1965 till present in our next seminar series.
Certainly would.
Right.
Well, that's a great idea. We'll keep that in mind, start planning for that one. I want to thank Al and Steve again. And before we give them a final thanks, I do want to encourage all of you to head down to the 3rd floor, where we have folks waiting to host us at a reception. So don't dawdle up here, head on downstairs. Al and Steve will be there and happy to continue the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you.